Hi, everyone. So, thank you so much for joining us for the second event of this year's six-part Waterloo Architecture Eris Craft Speaker Series, What is Solidarity? So, big thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Vic Mantha Blythe, and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm one of your moderators for the night, joined by Fiona Lim Tung, who you'll hear from in a moment. So, our talk today is centered around the main question of the speaker series, what is solidarity? Where we ask how we as architects participate in collective, long-term social movements for change and advocate within and beyond our professional obligations. Before we dive in, I just want to pause and take a moment to deliver a land acknowledgement. So I've been working on this acknowledgement for about a week, mulling it over, trying to capture in a short paragraph how Indigenous sovereignty, land back, and truth and reconciliation are intertwined with disability justice, gender rights, and the broader topic of accessibility. When I think of accessibility, I keep returning to the word access. Access to land, access to resources, access to participation. The Six Nations of the Grand River only has access to 5% of the original Haldeman Tract, land promised to the Haudenosaunee and situated in the territories of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee's people. I've been thinking about how we're all here in one meeting, and yet we're scattered around the globe, dialing in at different times in different places. And I'm reflecting on how wonderful it is that we can all have access to one another, how the relationships we made because of the community formed on the land of the School of Architecture still binds us even though we can't physically be together. I'm grateful. How amazing that the school can so easily pivot to an online platform. And then I pause and I wonder, why haven't we always held these talks online? Disability justice students and activists have continually advocated for the right to work digitally from home, to record talks for later viewing, to have access to education that isn't solely in a classroom. But it's only now, because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need to ensure learning is available to able-bodied students, that we have seen this shift. It makes me really think about the other ways our school is inaccessible and how that exclusion has been normalized by our institution. So while the move to an online platform is by no means a blanket solution and is in many ways poses a host of other problems, it's moved me to think about the importance of making connections with people who are not physically close. It helps me to understand how while we each have our own context and geographically specific struggle, we're all in solidarity with one another. I'm currently in Amiskwitchie, Wisconsin, where the Prayer Land Back Camp Pekawiwin has been providing access to shelter, food, and services for the houseless, who are disproportionately Indigenous, for over 2 months now. And the similarities of this camp to the 1492 Land Back Lane, located on the same Haldeman Tract as our school. And even further away, the Micmac fisheries of the East Coast that are currently under attack, and the Wet'suwet'en resistance on the West Coast, and how these Indigenous acts of resilience, though they're spread across Turtle Island, are connected. So while we're not all in the same land, our seemingly disconnected struggles for disability justice, gender rights, racial justice, and Indigenous sovereignty are deeply interconnected. The goal of this acknowledgement was to do more than to recognize the physical location of our school, but to work to understand that no matter where we're situated, we each have an inalienable responsibility to protect both the land and each other. Thanks, and I'm going to pass it over to Fiona.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Vic. That was amazing. So my name is Fiona Lim Tung. I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm a lecturer here at the University of Waterloo School of Architecture. It is my deep pleasure to introduce tonight's talk, which is entitled Breaking the Code, Designing for Non-Conforming Bodies. Accessibility directly dictates who's afforded privilege and access to space. As architects and as designers, we're taught design standards that reinforce existing power structures and are exclusionary to many. So how can we work with consultants, communities, and activists to design spaces that better serve the goal of social equity and inclusion? This conversation explores how architects can work in solidarity with disability and gender rights movements to challenge existing design standards and to understand what tools our architectural education affords us to create a more inclusive and accessible future. So tonight we are so fortunate to have with us from all across North America 3 speakers who are trailblazers in the field and who, through their experiences, their research, their advocacy, and their work, have championed an inclusionary approach to the design and the understanding of space. And they are helping to shape conversations around designing for non-conforming bodies. So we have with us Luke Anderson, who's the executive director at the Stopgap Foundation. We have Amy Hemry, who is the associate professor of medicine, health, and society, as well as American Studies and the director of the Critical Design Lab at Vanderbilt University, and Susan Stryker, who is the Barbara Lee Distinguished Chair in Women's Leadership at Mills College. And I'll follow with more detailed introductions before each speaker, starting with our first speaker, Luke Anderson. So Luke is the co-founder and the executive director at Stopgap Foundation. After a spinal cord injury in 2002, Luke was introduced to a world that is not well suited for a wheelchair user. And so frustration with encountering access barriers led him to co-found the Stopgap Foundation, which raises awareness about the importance of a barrier-free and inclusive society. Stopgap works with community leaders across Canada to deliver education and resources that inspire societal perspective shifts, the removal of barriers in the built environment, and policy change. So you may have seen and you may have used their iconic brightly painted ramps, which can be found in over 60 communities from coast to coast, and helping to advance our collective understanding about the importance of accessibility and inclusion. Luke's a licensed professional engineer, I believe a graduate of the University of Waterloo, a nature lover, an avid meditator, and I love this, an aspiring harmonica virtuoso. And he is also the recipient of a Governor General's Meritorious Service Medal. Luke, thank you. We're so happy to have you, and I'll pass it over to you.
All right. Oh, thanks for such an amazing introduction, Fiona. Thank you, everyone, for gifting myself and my esteemed co-presenters and everyone that was a part of pulling this amazing speaker series together for your time. Thank you for gifting all of us your attention, your precious time and energy during these really difficult times. Yeah, it's amazing that we can connect virtually despite what we're all experiencing now in our own little boats weathering the storm. So I hope this finds everyone managing as best as possible. I'm going to share my screen here. Drum roll. So I've titled my presentation today, Creating an Inclusive Society One Step at a Time. And in this first slide, there's a picture of some cartoony styled hands reaching upwards, palms out. This is a picture of a horse. Not just any horse. It's a picture of a racehorse. And what I'd like to draw your attention to, if you are able, and I'll do my best to describe what this horse is wearing, on the side of its eyes are blinders. So this brown horse is wearing a harness that includes blinders, and I connect with an interesting parallel between this picture of a horse wearing blinders and our society in general. So it's important for a racehorse like this one in the picture, to wear blinders to prevent itself from getting distracted from things in its peripheral field of view. And I like to draw a parallel between this horse wearing blinders and our society in general. I just believe that we just don't recognize everyone in our communities. And in my opinion, not only does this hold ourselves as individuals back from reaching our full potential, but it holds our communities back from reaching their full potential. So during my talk, I'd just like to invite you to feel into the metaphorical blinders that you might be wearing that hold you back from reaching your full potential in all of the aspects of life that you enjoy and are a part of. So as Fiona mentioned, I had a spinal cord injury in 2002, shortly after I graduated from the civil engineering program at Waterloo. And yeah, it was during a ride with my good friend Johnny wearing the blue helmet. That's me wearing the red jersey and the red helmet, and a couple of other friends that we were riding with on the day that this picture was taken. We're just perched on top of a pretty big mountain in the interior of British Columbia, enjoying many of the amazing trails that are featured in that part of our country. It's kind of the mecca for mountain biking in Canada and the world for that matter. But yeah, it was on a ride with my friend Johnny when I bit off a little more than I could chew. I crashed. I flew over my handlebars and I landed head first, breaking a couple of vertebrae in my upper spine, causing a spinal cord injury. And the way that I like to explain it is I was all of a sudden introduced to a world that's really not well suited for someone that uses a wheelchair. I left my life as I knew it. So over time, I slowly began to get to know what my new physical reality was all about and how to navigate my community as independently and spontaneously as possible. And I wanted to put my engineering degree to work. So I sent a bunch of resumes out there to some different engineering firms, and I got a great job with a renowned firm that I know Adrian knows of. But I'm sure that many of you have heard of Blackwell Structural Engineers. It's an amazing structural engineering firm in downtown Toronto. Amazing group of people. We took on some fantastic projects. But there was one big issue. The building that the office was in had 3 steps that separated the sidewalk level from the elevator lobby level. And this is a picture of that front entryway on Duncan Street in downtown Toronto. And the picture shows 3 concrete steps with me poking. I'm shown there in the open doorway, double set of old antique doors to the front entry of the building, and a big, heavy, folding aluminum ramp that is bridging the gap between the sidewalk level and the elevator lobby level. So this ramp needed to be deployed every time I wanted to get in and out of the building. So just imagine what that would be like, to have to rely on someone. Usually it was a coworker who would help me, but imagine what it would be like to rely on someone to help you negotiate an entryway to a place that you frequent on a regular basis. Maybe it's, say, your home or your place of work, somewhere in the community that you visit regularly. Well, I had to deal with this ramp for almost 8 years. So 8 years I had to deal with getting the ramp set up and taking it down whenever I wanted to come and go. And so that led to a profound frustration with this issue, a frustration that had already existed from just having to encounter barriers that were preventing me from accessing the spaces that I wanted to access. And an amazing thing that was happening whenever this ramp was left out, everybody loved using it. Everybody wanted it left out. I have vivid memories of couriers running down the sidewalk with their big heavy packages on dollies, wanting us to leave the ramp out so they could use it too. Parents pushing strollers the elderly, or people with temporary disabilities that were visiting one of the physiotherapy clinics on one of the upper floors of the office. All of these people wanted the ramp left out as well. And it started to dawn on me that, wow, when we put something in place for someone with a disability, everybody benefits. And I started thinking, well, why don't we take these amazing conversations and try to broadcast them beyond the front step of this building, and try to stimulate a conversation about the value that a ramp or a barrier-free amenity can add to a location or a business. Let's start a conversation about how we as Canadians have a human right to equal access. And let's get people thinking about really great solutions that can help overcome some of the many barriers that prevent so many people from accessing space. So in 2011, myself and my good friend and coworker Michael Hopkins, we put our heads together, and we also pulled together a bunch of volunteers and some donated building materials, and we assembled a list of business owners in Toronto's Junction neighborhood with an ask. Now, these business owners were all had locations with single-stepped entryways, and we asked them if they'd like to be a part of an awareness-raising initiative whereby they would receive a lightweight, deployable, colorful access ramp at no cost. And it was really difficult, actually, to get those first 13 business owners to participate, because many business owners told us that they didn't need a ramp because they didn't have any customers that used wheelchairs. I'll leave that one with you for a second to digest. Other business owners told us they didn't want one because they could simply bring stuff outside if somebody wanted to access their services. So these responses just told us that we had a lot of work to do, and that there's so much ignorance out there surrounding this issue. We did finally get some business owners to participate, and we pulled together a website where people could go and learn more about the initiative. And I'm a lover of puns, and Michael is crafty in the wordsmithing department, and came up with the name of the initiative and named it Stopgap, and stenciled the website right on the ramp so people could go and learn more about the initiative if they wanted to. Well, it was a hit, and all of the business owners loved the ramps. Their customers loved them. The residents in the neighborhood absolutely loved them, and we started to get some serious media attention and inquiries from fellow advocates and like-minded accessibility champions across the country, wanting to know how they could bring our project to their community. And so we started sharing all of the resources that we had accumulated since we started, and soon we started seeing ramps pop up in communities all across Canada. And up until last year, we were wondering why there weren't any ramps in Saskatchewan. For whatever reason, we hadn't heard from anyone in Saskatchewan, but we formulated some theories. Maybe it's really flat there, and they don't have steps or something, or maybe it's like daylight savings time, and that was messing up our correspondence. But anyway, we did finally hear from Saskatchewan, and we now have ramps from coast to coast to coast. So we have grown significantly from the first ramps that landed in the Junction in 2011. We have our community ramp project, which I just explained. which allows advocates to take on our work in their communities. And we've also developed a school program, which is one of my most passionate aspects of my work, where I'm able to go into classrooms and share my story and our work with the Stopgap Foundation. This is a photo of myself giving a presentation to a group of grade 5 and 6 students. But we've also developed a curriculum that helps support students in post-secondary education as well as secondary education. So we have elementary, secondary, and post-secondary education that unfortunately is on pause right now due to the pandemic, but we fully intend on bringing that back on board because of how important it is. There is no standard curriculum for education centered around barrier-free design, disability, accessibility, inclusion, and diversity. And I think this is a really big problem because, well, as our population ages, we are really going to need to have a multitude of options and affordable options for barrier-free access that just isn't in the market right now. And of course, for many reasons why this curriculum is just such an important part of standard curriculum. And I'm just so excited to be connecting with all of you today, because these opportunities to engage with students like yourselves enrolled in a design program doesn't exist. And so really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. There's our pal, the horse, bright blue sky, no longer wearing blinders. Looks like he's maybe just had a chomp of hay or grass, a little bit of grass there on the tongue that's sticking out. So when I started to feel into the blinders that I was wearing, I started to recognize people for what they can do instead of what they can't do. And I started to realize that it's not us as humans that have disabilities, but it's the places that we live, that we learn, that we play in and work in that are disabling. So I challenge you to feel into how you can help support this important work and the messages that I've shared with you, and the messages that you'll continue to hear throughout the speaker series tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Luke. I'm going to pass it on to Amy Hamrai. Amy is a writer, a scholar, a teacher, and a critical maker. Their research focuses on the relationships between bodies and built environments. They are Associate Professor of Medicine, Health, and Society and American Studies at Vanderbilt University. Amy is also the director of the Critical Design Lab, which is a multidisciplinary collaborative of disabled designers and researchers who approach accessibility through disability justice and cultural frameworks. Amy's interdisciplinary research spans critical disability studies, science and technology studies, design and urbanism, critical race theory, and the environmental humanities. They're widely published in journals and also the author of the book, Building Access, Universal Design, and the Politics of Disability. Thanks, Amy. I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, Fiona. I believe that Mary's going to share my slides. Thank you. Okay, so my name is Amy Hamrai. I use they, them pronouns. I'm joining you from the original homelands of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Shawnee, and Yuchi peoples. And I just want to highlight that, all the while that we're talking about accessibility, we are often talking about struggles for spatial justice on stolen and forcibly ceded lands. And we need to think about how to incorporate anti-colonial frameworks into our struggles for disability justice as well. My slide here says accessibility, what counts as evidence? So I'm going to talk about an idea that is central to my work, which is that accessibility is something that we achieve not just through designing, but also through specific ways of knowing. And what that means is that designers, such as architects, always rely on specific bases of knowledge. This is often scientific, experiential, or professional. And they often make claims about evidence as they try to design better, more inclusive spaces. All codes and standards rely on forms of evidence, and I'll show an example in just a second. And so what I do in a lot of my work is to intervene into what is known or claimed to be known and introduce ways to know differently, to reframe ways to talk about accessibility codes, but also go beyond them. And so when we say that we want to meet accessibility codes, but also go beyond them, one of the things that we're talking about is how to go into the realm of the unknown or the unknowable, and to pay more attention to things that are currently unknown, and to practice a politics of evidence, how to design a world with disability in mind when so much is unknown or excluded from what we can know. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So when I arrived at my current position at Vanderbilt in 2013, a claim that I heard constantly from people who were campus administrators and people who use the campus was that this campus is 100% compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is the law in the United States that gives rights of access and participation to disabled people. I knew that this was untrue because, first of all, I don't think that there are any spaces that are 100% compliant with the ADA. But I also knew from my own attempts to navigate the campus as a person with chronic pain. I knew from similar reports by other students, faculty, and staff on campus. And I also knew because there were so many really old buildings on campus, and some of them didn't even have elevators. But at the same time, I am someone who, in my scholarship, I have a lot of commitments to going beyond the sort of liberal politics of recognition and inclusion by the state, and to think more critically about the Americans with Disabilities Act and some of its limitations in addition to what it enables. And as a historian studying the emergence of accessibility as also part of racialized and gendered regimes, I wanted to respond to this idea that the campus was 100% accessible by also bringing in frameworks from intersectionality, from disability justice, thinking about how to make campus spaces more habitable and usable for trans and queer people, for BIPOC people, undocumented people, and unhoused people. And so it was really a question about reframing compliance as the baseline of accessibility, or as the most important way to know if inclusion has been achieved. And how to strategize to do that in ways that showed people who had power over resources, such as campus administrators, but also just everybody else who uses a campus space, that compliance doesn't exist and that compliance simultaneously is not the standard that we should be working toward. If we can go to the next slide, please. So what I'm going to talk about here is some strategies toward what I've been calling sociospatial practice. And this is drawing on a concept actually from performance art, social practice, which is art that intervenes often in the manner of social science or community engagement into material arrangements. And there's sort of a similar idea in architecture called spatial practice. And so when I say sociospatial practice, I'm talking about how when we engage in accessibility struggles, we're not just designing new things. We can use design processes, community engagement processes also as disruptive practices. And we can design them in ways that operate as direct action, We can choreograph responses and counter responses. And within an institutional context, we can do it strategically in ways that are much more effective than just like writing a letter to the chancellor asking for more money for ramps. And so some of the strategies that I'm going to talk about here were ways of training people to read built environments differently than they typically do, especially if they are non-disabled people or people who are not identified with exclusion from the built environment, to introduce elements of surprise and disruption, to rewrite standards and codes, and in the process of that, to change the kinds of data that is used in accessibility, and to do this using institutional funding, but without asking for institutional permission. If we can go to the next slide. So this is an image of an activist project from 1974 at the University of California, Berkeley. It's a street map drawn by Ruth Grimes, and it is a map that was used to show that if we put curb cuts at these particular strategic locations, curb cuts are ramps that go from the sidewalk to the street, that there could be greater facilitation of accessibility in the community surrounding the university. This is a document that I use in my historical research, but kind of looking into the history of this practice of disability activist mapping brought up a lot for me in terms of thinking about what activists do. We don't just engage in direct action in the sense of like protesting in front of government buildings. We also produce knowledge, we produce data visualizations, and we use this strategically to make demands for certain kinds of spaces. So in the Critical Design Lab, we started a project in 2014 called Mapping Access. And it was in part trying to draw on some of the strategies of the disability movement of the 1960s and 70s in order to engage in these kinds of data visualization practices and produce a different sort of narrative, first on the Vanderbilt University campus, and then all the other places that people have taken this up. So if we can go to the next slide. This is an image of a group of disabled and non-disabled students, staff, and administrators sitting in a room with tables and these like blue and purple walls. It's one of the campus flex maker spaces. The first thing that we did with this project was to ask groups of people what accessibility meant to them and basically rewrite standards from scratch. So the ADA standard exists. It's really good and it's based on evidence in certain ways, but it has limitations. And so we wanted to expand what we thought of as accessibility within our kind of local context. And the things that people came up with were really interesting because they were asking questions about how, disability access intersects with gender, such as around bathrooms and lactation spaces. They were asking about how a space could be considered accessible when it was named after like Confederate generals or slave owners. And so in this process of having conversations with the community, we created what we kind of considered to be a radical standard, and a standard that asked questions that got people to think more critically about the built environment and wasn't just like a checklist. So on the next slide, there's like a little screenshot view of a piece of paper that has printed out on it. It says Mapathon Survey Checklist, and then there's a manila folder, and this is the time of day when I forget words, a ruler. And this is the type of document that we used in order to gather evidence of campus accessibility through events that we called mapathons. If we can go to the next slide. So we had lots of these mapathons. Here's a poster that shows this sort of like map dot with a gold star in it, which is the Vanderbilt logo, and it says Mapping Access Project, help make Vanderbilt a more inclusive campus for all students, faculty, staff, and visitors. So the goal of these events was to have a kind of like open and inviting event that would get a bunch of people to come and show up and get those surveys that I just showed and go out all over campus and do accessibility audits using the radical standard that we had created. We kind of like appealed to the sensibilities of like campus student organizations and things like that. At the time that we were doing this, there was only one organization on campus that was a self-advocacy organization for disabled students. Most of the organizations were kind of like doing things for disabled people. And so we also wanted to create a space that had disability culture in it. And so people would come to these mapathons, they would like get a packet, they would get assigned to a group. They would go to like a panel discussion about disability justice or disability in film or disability in feminism. And then they would go out into the campus and do the audits. And it was kind of strategically organized so that they would be with at least like one disabled student, staff, or faculty member in their group, and often someone who could not access the building that they were assigned to go to, but they didn't really know that. So they would arrive at the building, they would kind of watch as someone experienced a bunch of barriers and document them, and then come back and, express concern and have new forms of knowledge about how inaccessible the campus was. And the other thing that happened in the course of this was that suddenly university administrators noticed that a bunch of people were doing this, and of course then had to respond to it in some way because they were worried about what the data may reveal about the narrative that had been told before. So if we can go to the next slide, this is an image of a group of people going out into the campus, looking at a survey. There are 3 people in a room with some couches and chairs and books, and someone holding a tape measure, and they're kind of like looking inquisitively at the room. On the next slide, there's a screenshot of a Twitter feed. So we would live tweet these events. And there's some tweets from me from a panel that we had about why accessibility is a feminist issue, talking about who bathrooms are and are not designed for, the lack of all gender restrooms on campus. There's like a picture of the panel. So there's a sort of social media component. And so what this was doing was that it was giving kind of a space, discursive and material space to this type of event on campus, and showing a particular framework for thinking about disability and access as intersecting with race and gender and class, as well as thinking about disability in kind of like a very literal sense. And it kind of made it difficult for institutional pushback in a lot of ways, because theoretically, at least, institutions want to be aligned with these kinds of like equity and diversity initiatives. But to do this in like a more critical way also kind of forced like a higher standard. So on the next slide, I'm showing one screenshot from one of the maps that we made with this data. This is a map of all of the all-gender restrooms on campus. And there's like an aerial view of the streets. The dots on the map they're blue, and unfortunately, they very problematically have this like gender binary symbol of the bathroom on them. That's just like the way the map designer created it. And then there's a drop-down menu that says all gender restrooms, and it says VU mapping access at the top. And so what this kind of map did was we set out to say we're mapping all the accessible parts of campus. And then in reality, it turns out there are not that many accessible parts of campus. And so the map actually shows very few all gender restrooms. And this was used to do advocacy around this issue and around other issues, to show the wide expanses of campus where there is not an all-gender restroom available. And then I'll go to my last slide. So what ended up happening, oh, sorry, one more slide after that. Okay, what ended up happening in this process was kind of surprising to me. The university decided that it needed to collect its own accessibility data. So it went from saying everything was 100% accessible to, we know it's inaccessible, we want to control the knowledge about this. And so they invested a ton of money into a 40-year master planning process. It was the first one ever focused on accessibility, called Future VU. And I participated in this process with them, with the planning department and with the campus architect, and some really interesting things happened because they had already started from a place of having the data that we had collected for our project. So thinking about disability in an intersectional way, thinking about historic preservation, and thinking about going beyond the code. So there's an image on this slide of two older buildings. They're brick and they have these white columns on the outside. And these are like 19th century classroom buildings. And then one of the design solutions that the campus architect and the task force came up with was that if we couldn't put in a circulation corridor within these older buildings for like elevators and ramps and stuff like that, they would just build a new building going between them. And so here there's this sort of glass and steel building that connects the two older ones. On the interior, it has a ramp that winds up and it houses the elevator and it has a cafe and stuff. This isn't really perfect. There's still this kind of like monumental staircase thing going on that I'm not particularly fond of, but it is an example of how operating on the level of a politics of knowledge and thinking about, you know, what counts as accessibility and how can we know that can change design outcomes and can be a strategy for going beyond the code. And I will wrap up there.
Thanks so much, Amy. And I'd like to introduce now Susan Stryker. Susan's Professor Emerita of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Arizona and currently holds the Barbara Lee Professorship in Women's Leadership at Mills College. Susan's an award-winning scholar and filmmaker, and her research includes transgender, queer, feminist studies, LGBTQ history, film and media, built environments, somotechnics, and critical cultural theory. Susan's also the founding editor of TSQ Transgender Studies Quarterly and the author of Transgender History, The Roots of Today's Revolution. Susan's also won an Emmy Award as the co-director of the documentary film Screaming Queens, The Ride at Compton's Cafeteria, a Lambda Literary Award for the co-edited anthology The Transgender Studies Reader, and the Ruth Benedict Book Prize for the co-edited anthology The Transgender Studies Reader 2. Susan, I'll pass it on to you.
Right. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you to my co-panelists and everyone who invited me to be here, to the audience for coming. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from San Francisco, which occupies the unceded traditional lands of the Ohlone people. We had planned today, or I had planned today, to show you some material that's on a website about an architectural project I've been involved in. We're having a little difficulty technically, so I'm going to speak for a few minutes, and then Mayuri's graciously offered to put the website up on the screen. So I'll be talking today about the stalled gender-neutral public toilet project. Just a little bit about my interest. It's, as Fiona mentioned, it's like I'm mostly trained as a historian. I'm a filmmaker. I do cultural studies, mostly on trans and queer topics. But where I really became interested in spatial problems, I mean, there's sort of two sort of biographical and vocational roots for me on this. One of them is that as a trans person, there's a way that I think of the process of going through what often gets called a medicalized gender transition is essentially it's kind of like thinking about the body as a built environment. Like how is it that you like change the physical structure of something in order to like inhabit it in a way that feels better for you, or that it's also a kind of project of engineering or visualization. That there's a sense of self that you have that's not apparent to other people, and that you engage in a project to like make your sense of self perceivable to others through transforming how it is that you appear and how it is that you move through the world, so that there's a design component to it, and that at some level being trans for me is about materializing something that is imperceptible through practice, that through an iterative practice of transforming self and world and relation between the two, you create an opportunity to like manifest self publicly in a different way. The way I started thinking about spatial issues in a more sort of work-related way was when I was working on this film called Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria, where I had found material in an archive, textual documentation that described an event in San Francisco in 1966 called, it didn't have a name, but it described a riot at a place called Compton's Cafeteria at the corner of Turk and Taylor Street in San Francisco, where transgender people who would frequent the restaurant late at night were routinely harassed by the police. And one night in August of 1966, they fought back, and it's one of the first recorded instances of sort of trans and queer militant resistance to like structural police violence directed at such people, 3 years before the more famous Stonewall riot in New York. And so in trying to learn more about that event, I was actually having a lot of trouble finding textual information, and archival historical documents and primary source materials about the event. And where I was actually able to begin to understand the dynamics of the event was actually through kind of a more spatial analysis of like actually getting out into the Tenderloin neighborhood, learning about the history of the built environment there, learning the history of the Tenderloin as a space in the city that had been designated as a sex work ghetto, learning about histories of anti-trans discrimination and employment and housing that concentrated trans women as sex workers in this particular neighborhood. Learning about the history of the SRO hotels. And it was actually by understanding the logic of the built environment that I understood something about an event that happened there, that I really got a sense of the relationship between space and event and the way that space can structure an event. And so, these sort of theoretical interests in thinking spatially as sort of an analog to my historical research led me to become involved with a project at UC Berkeley, which is called it's called the Arcus Endowment for the Study of Sexuality in the Built Environment, which was a program that would bring in a scholar every year to be a visiting professor and to talk about sexuality in the built environment. And one year, the Arcus scholar in residence at Berkeley was an architect named Joel Sanders, who's now at Yale University. And I met Joel through my involvement with the Arcus project at Berkeley. And, it was a very friendly relationship, but, he went back to New York and we sort of lost touch with each other until 2015. when Joel contacted me out of the blue and said, I've been thinking about you and remembering our conversations, from 10 or 15 years ago, and would like to run some ideas by you. And Joel was also someone who'd been interested in the relationship between sexuality and the built environment. He'd written a book called Stud, the Architectures of Masculinity, that had come out of his work in designing domestic spaces for gay male couples and thinking, how do we redesign the home if it's not oriented around the idea of sort of heteronormative biological reproduction and family. But what Joel contacted me about was saying, I've really been thinking about the debates going on about transgender access to public toilets. And, I'm getting much more interested in doing public architecture than private architecture. I think really thinking through the problem of the public toilet, just sounds really interesting to me right now. And I'd love to collaborate with you. And we did. We just, started this very informal collaboration. We co-authored a couple of short articles. But what came out of those initial conversations was the stalled gender-neutral public toilet project. So, I was kind of the theory head, person who didn't know that much about architecture, but liked to think about bodies and spaces. And had, experience being in the world as trans. And Joel was the architect and designer. And we brought in a third person, Terry Kogan, who's a law professor at the University of Utah, who's one of the world's leading experts on sort of the legal dimensions of trans public toilet access. And we wanted to bring in someone who was doing legal work because we saw very quickly that however clever we might be in terms of coming up with design, that there were barriers to implementing those designs because of plumbing codes that required sex-segregated binary public toilets. So Terry really helped us with the legal dimensions of the project. So what I'd like to do now is to ask Mary to play the video that's on this website. As we start to do that, I'll just say the address for this website, it's stalled.online, very easy to remember. I will sort of narrate this as it goes along since we don't have sound. That was the big problem. So we see Joel Sanders speaking. Actually, could you start the video again? I wasn't quite ready to start narrating it. Okay, so here we go. So we see the logo for Stalled. Joel Sanders says, we thought about using the public toilet as a point of departure to address the creation of safe, inclusive restrooms for everyone, irrespective of age, gender, religion, and disability. Then I say the current campaigns against transgender people being in the public toilets is just the latest example of a long history of trying to exclude marginalized people from public space. Milestones in the struggle for toilet access include having women's restrooms designed in the 1880s. This is moving along. Can you stop for a second? It's moving along a little faster than I can describe. So we were situating the history of public toilet access in the long history of struggles over access to public toilets. That this included, first of all, designing the first sex-segregated public toilets in the late 19th century. It's very hard to narrate this. Sorry for the confusion. Anyway, so hopefully you can just read the captions along the bottom that summarizes the history of public controversies over toilet access. We will now be getting to the more design focused parts of this. So as the video is pointing out, while opponents to transgender access to public toilets usually talk about danger to cisgender people, what we actually see is that it's actually trans people who are more susceptible to violence in traditional sex-segregated public toilets. And so our design work was starting with the idea of how can we design better bathrooms for trans people, but in doing that, we learned that we would actually help promote access for a wide variety of other users who had non-compliant bodies or who were minoritized in some other way. So, as Joel points out, the most common approach to creating an all-gender restroom is what gets called the single-user solution, that, you know, there's just one toilet in the room that's single occupancy, ADA compliant bathroom labeled gender neutral. We don't favor this. You know, we think this approach stigmatizes not only trans and gender non-conforming people by segregating them from the rest of the population, that it's a separate but not equal solution. And that what we favor instead is a multi-user solution, which is pretty common, but we extend the idea of making the restroom a single open space where you replace the typical stalls who have, you know, lots of sort of peekaboo gaps in it that compromise privacy, with floor-to-ceiling partitions and communal areas for washing and grooming. And that we developed a process to retrofit sex-segregated restrooms according to the standards that we developed to take the multi-user approach a step further. First of all, we remove the plumbing stack wall and treat the bathroom as one open space. We then eliminate the corridor wall, treating the bathroom as a porous extension of the hallway. We add 3 different types of fully enclosed stalls, what we were calling standard, ambulatory, and ADA compliant, as well as adding multi-person caregiver rooms, which include sinks and changing tables. We add communal grooming and washing stations off the main circulation path into the space. And finally, a lounge that transforms the corridor into an animated social space. We think this solution has 3 advantages to the standard way of doing public toilets. Restroom users can visually monitor one another, create more a sense of a shared common space with many different kinds of people occupying it. That creates greater safety. Gender non-conforming people are not stuck between 2 options, neither of which align with their sense of self. It serves the needs of trans people in that you don't have to pick a binary option, and that it also accommodates a wide range of differently embodied people, including caregivers, elderly, parents with other gendered children, Muslims who might need to practice ritual ablutions, you know, and you know, a variety of other people. We've also designed a high-use space, like for an airport, for example, that reimagines the restroom as an open precinct that's animated by 3 different activity zones: grooming, washing, and eliminating. That's basically it for the design. You know, I encourage you to go and look at the website. The website has a lot of different resources on it. It has essays on architectural history, essays on how we went about our code revision activism. There's you know, a variety of resources for people who would like to try to implement these kinds of ideas. and there's a discussion of the design methodology practice that we developed as we were doing this work. So I think I look at the clock and I see that we're at 4:35 California time. I think we've got about 25 minutes left for the event. So rather than spending any more time talking about the website and the project, I think I'll stop now and we can move into the commentary and question period.